welcome. Hi, Annalee. Hi, Josh. We're joined today to discuss the Radium Age, Voices from the Radium Age, edited by Joshua Glenn. We're joined today by Joshua Glenn, writer and semiotician. He's the editor of the Radium Age series and the publisher of High Low Brow. He is the co-author of several books, including The Idler's Glossary and Unboard, The Essential Field Guide to Serious Fun. Annalee Newitz is here with us today as well. They write science fiction and nonfiction. They are the author of the book Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age, and the novels The Future of Another Timeline and Anonymous, which won the Lambda Literary Award. As a science journalist, they are a writer for the New York Times and elsewhere, and have a monthly column in The New Scientist. Welcome, y'all. I'm so excited to have you. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Hey,
Absolutely.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll turn it over to you guys. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, I was just saying to Annalee, my old friend, that I'm not a very good reader. I mean, I'm a super reader, but I'm not very good at reading aloud. So I was hoping to read the shortest possible reading. In fact, just one paragraph from the introduction to this new book.
Beautifully illustrated book.
Yes, thank you. By the cartoonist Seth. And let me just read one paragraph and then we'll get going.
All right.
This is from the series forward that actually appears in all of that will appear in all of the books. Do we really know science fiction? There were the scientific romance years that stretched from the mid-19th century to circa 1900. And there was the genre's so-called golden age from circa 1935 through the early 1960s. But between those periods and overshadowed by them was an era that has bequeathed us such tropes as the robot, berserk or benevolent, the tyrannical Superman, the dystopia, the unfathomable extraterrestrial, the sinister telepath, and the eco-catastrophe. A dozen years ago, writing for the science fiction blog IO9 at the invitation of Annalee Newitz and Charlie Jane Anders, I became fascinated with the period during which the science fiction genre as we know it emerged. Inspired by the exactly contemporaneous career of Marie Curie, who shared a Nobel Prize for her discovery of radium in 1903, only to die of radiation-induced leukemia in 1934, I eventually dubbed this 3-decade interregnum the Radium Age. So there's a little context for this project.
Yeah, I remember when you first were writing about it for me at IO9, you were calling it the pre-Golden Age. So I'm glad that you kind of settled on something that wasn't just like before the Golden Age. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what are some of the main tropes, and also who are some of the main contributors to Radium Age science fiction?
Yeah. Sure. So, just to go back to the kind of rename, why we can get into why it's called Radium Age. But when I first started writing for you at IO9 and Charlie Jane, I didn't know anything about this era. I was just interested in learning about. I had read Brian Aldiss's book Billion Year Spree, which is a history of science fiction, and he's really good on the scientific romance era of Wells and Verne and Poe before that. And he's very good on the Golden Age. And then in between, he sort of, there's Aldous Huxley, there's Charlotte Perkins Gilman, there's a couple of things happening there, but it's mostly just kind of bad pulp science fiction. Let's just not think about it. It's an embarrassing part of science fiction. It all started getting good with the Golden Age, thanks to John Campbell and so forth.
Yes, not at all pulpy, of course.
Yeah, and I had internalized that discourse myself. And so as I was just like, well, there must be more there. There must be something worth reading. And as I started reading this stuff, I was still had internalized that idea about the history of science fiction enough that I was calling it the pre-Golden Age, because the Golden Age is so important. Realizing only later that they had named it the Golden Age at the time. It was sort of a propaganda move by those guys. And I mean guys, all these white males who were basically steamrolling over this whole weird, interesting earlier science fiction that was in some ways more diverse, more interesting than the Golden Age was. Much as I like the Golden Age, I love a lot of that writing, but there was kind of a Cold War propaganda effort to kind of erase this utopian, weird, idealistic, strange earlier moment. Now I've forgotten the question.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things, when you say it's more diverse, one of the things that's super interesting about Radium Age is that there is a strand of feminist science fiction that you just don't see at all, really, in the Golden Age. I mean, there's maybe little bits at the margins, but things like Charlotte Perkins Gilman and, writing Herland, which is like the kind of feminist utopia.
Well, not the
And
first.
not the first, but it's one of them. It's certainly the most influential in the 20th century. And I think definitely influences Wonder Woman, for example, and a lot of other stories that come later. And so, yeah, it is interesting that then Golden Age comes in and it's just kind of like none of that ever happened. So, so tell us, like, who are some of the big names that we should be reading in Radium Age? And I mean, obviously some of them are part of this series.
Right. So some of the big names, and I'm going to kind of mix and match here because some of them are really only known to science fiction readers, whereas others are well known outside of science fiction. They just happen to write some science fiction, or what I call proto science fiction. I'm trying to distinguish between if the scientific romance is 19th century and science fiction emerged out of Hugo Gernsback's magazines and so forth in the sort of late 20s, we should call something else in between. So right now, at the moment, I'm calling it proto science fiction. But so Olaf Stapleton, British philosopher who wrote, I won't name all the titles that they wrote, but he was an important one, Star Maker and so forth, very influential world builder, universe builder. William Hope Hodgson, who was sort of one of the earliest new weird. Muriel Jaeger is a British female science fiction writer from the era, one of a handful of women science fiction writers from the era. Karel Čapek, who wrote R.U.R., the first robot story, and coined the term robot. G.K. Chesterton, who's a conservative Catholic, anti-Wellesian, but wrote very interesting and entertaining sort of anti-Wells science fiction. Cicely Hamilton, who was a lesbian suffragist and very brave World War I volunteer. Wrote one of the first kind of a post-apocalyptic post-World War I novels. W.E.B. Du Bois, the African-American social scientist and activist, wrote some science fiction from that era. Cicely Hamilton. Yevgeny Zamyatin, the Russian, who wrote We, which circulated in samizdat for decades before it finally saw publication in the West. E.V. Odell, who you know very well, Annalee, because I asked you to write the introduction to that one.
Yeah, I love that. I love his book, Clockwork Man. It's incredible.
Yeah, he was sort of a hanger-on of the Bloomsbury Circle, which, as you point out in your introduction, was a very female-driven and dominated circle, and he was a sort of a early feminist man.
I mean, it's funny because Clockwork Man, which is part of the first crop of books coming out in this series, it is about a feminist utopia, basically, and it's also about toxic masculinity, and it's all these tropes that would feel absolutely of the moment. Like if you were reading it now, it wouldn't feel out of place at all. And he was writing it in the teens, basically.
Yeah, it's about cyborgs, about the singularity, but it's also about cricket and small English towns, and it's funny. It's kind of an amazing story.
Yeah, it is. It's very goofy, but it's also about women who rise up and eradicate all men by putting them into virtual reality. So,
they can put their shit together. I'm dragging on this. I'm answering a question, but Arthur Conan Doyle, Bulgakov, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and E.M. Forster, who has a story in this first anthology that came out. One of the things that you've said to me, and then in a bunch of other places talking about Radium Age, is that it feels to me like you really want to make it clear that there's a lot of literary writers who are participating in this, like W.E.B. Du Bois, E.M. Forster, like people that we recognize now as literary greats who get taught in, contemporary college courses. Why is it important to you to make that point? It's not something that people say about the Golden Age. Like no one is like, oh yes, the Golden Age, full of great literary writing. Isaac Asimov's is, prolific writer, but not a literary writer.
I mean, Ray Bradbury is a beautiful writer, but yes, you're absolutely right.
True. I mean, and I think, yeah.
Well, I think science fiction, and it wasn't called science fiction then, but I think that genre didn't become embarrassing until sort of the 30s with the pulp science fiction that was just being cranked out, as fast as possible to make a buck. And so I think if you're writing this, what I'm calling proto science fiction, and in the 1900s or 1910s, 1920s, it was just something else you could try. So if you were Jack London, you could write a Klondike novel. You could also write a novel about a guy who's strapped into a straitjacket and he travels the cosmos through some kind of astral projection. And you can write, science fiction, which he wrote a couple of science fiction novels as well. So I think it was just something else you could do, and people were just kind of dabbling in it. And it wasn't all as solidified as a genre yet. So maybe you were really writing horror, but then you were setting it in the future. So then it's kind of become science fiction, even though you were thinking maybe it was a horror novel. So yeah. What kind of here?
It's funny because, we were talking before we started about modernism, which was, of course, a literary aesthetic that was very popular in the early 20th century. And one of the things that modernist writers, like here in the United States, I think, like, when we think of modernism, we think of like William Faulkner, perfect example of like high modernist. In Europe, it would be, someone like, anyway, it doesn't matter because we're talking about the United States here for the moment. Part of the aesthetic of modernism is the idea that it's very complicated and that it's not pulpy. It's not something that gets churned out, And so there's, like later in the 20th century, as you know, in postmodernism, we start saying once again that like maybe there's not such a big difference between literary and pop culture or literary and pulp culture. So do you think that the radium age was kind of like the postmodern era in that people didn't really have a big distinction between like something like science fiction as a genre or proto-science fiction as a genre and just plain old literature? Or do you think something else was going on? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, science fiction, one of the definitions I like of science fiction is that it's, it's kind of a hybrid genre that's comes out of a bunch of different communities of practice around, different genres. And science fiction was borrowing from, different things to invent itself during this period that we're talking about. And so, for example, the idea of the telepath, you asked me earlier about tropes from this era. The telepath, we take it for granted that's a science fiction concept now. It makes total sense to us that there would be a telepath on the Starship Enterprise or whatever. Mm-hmm. And how in the future, maybe we, through mutation or through science or something, or aliens, telepathy will be possible.
Mm-hmm.
It's not possible, but we accept it as part of science fiction as something futuristic because proto-science fiction writers at that time were borrowing the idea from the occult, from occult literature.
Mm-hmm.
Just like they were borrowing ideas from horror and romance and detective novels and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I think that it is a little mushier. And to get into your question about modernism, one of the if you have to boil down this whole incredible ferment of the first 3 decades of the 20th century into like a phrase, there's a great book called The Culture of Time and Space by Stephen Kern. I'm sure you know it.
There you go. Nice.
1918. And he talks about how this was an era where traditional hierarchies were being leveled. And so you see that in Cubism, for example, where, foreground and background get flattened. And then you see also, artistic genres intermingling. And so Gertrude Stein is inspired by Cubism to write in a Cubist way. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Is inspired by, he loves early movies, and he loves the montage that you see in some early movies. And how can I bring the montage into literature? So we're seeing a lot of artistic genres kind of breaking down and merging into each other in interesting ways. And also just in general, the idea of hierarchy. And of course, it's an era of like revolutionary ferment and, aristocracy giving way to democracy. So it's, there's a lot of overthrowing of things, everything being the way they're supposed to be, which is what's so interesting to me about Marie Curie and discovery of radium.
Yeah.
Read something else out loud here. I was just looking at Henry Adams's book, The Education of Henry Adams. So Henry Adams was the grandson of John Quincy Adams. He's a Boston Brahmin. He was very, had raised in a very traditional, stuffy way and got educated in the classics. And he was living through these first decades of the 20th century. And he was like, my education did not prepare me for this. We should have studied science and technology, Mm-hmm. And so that book is amazing, all about.
I love that book.
Dynamos at the World's Fair. And
he talks about a future of female cyborgs running the world in that book. So I was like, yes, you got it right, sort of.
So there's a great quote from that where he says, the man of science must have been sleepy indeed, who did not jump from his chair like a scared dog when, in 1898, Mademoiselle Curie, probably should be Madame Curie, threw on his desk the metaphysical bomb she called radium. There remained no hole to hide in. Even metaphysics swept back over science with the green water of the deep sea ocean, and no one could longer hope to bar out the unknowable, for the unknowable was known. So there's this idea that radium, right, and radiation, which gave us the first glimpse of this idea that the atom is not solid, that the atom is partly in motion, that everything solid is actually in motion. It's an incredibly almost anarchistic idea that had far-ranging effects not just in science, right, but in culture and technology everywhere. And people were quite freaked out. Some people were very excited about it. Some people were frightened of it. But it was it had this incredible impact, that discovery of radium and radiation.
Yeah, it changed the way we understood everything, all of reality. He also talks in that book about the wonder of the dynamo and creating electricity, and how there's just an invisible force out there, which we can now harness, which again, you can totally see how that feeds into some of the themes in Radium Age science fiction, where suddenly there are unknowable forces out there that are affecting us, and we're starting to be able to perceive them, whether those forces are aliens or telepathy or some other kind of thing. But there's that sense of an unknowable world that is about to be discovered, that we're really like, science is going to help us discover everything, and we're going to understand everything. And so that is part, but then at the same time, there's chaos.
Exactly.
And
that's an important part of it. We can know it. The unknowable is becoming known, but we can't conceive of it. We can know it, but we can't our minds can't grasp it. So it's almost like cosmic horror, which Lovecraft would pick up on sort of later in the Radium Age. But there's a lot of early kind of cosmic horror stapled in, it's included, where people were just, their minds are being blown by what we were learning about the size of the universe and the age of the universe and radium, and like you say, electricity was taking over from steam in the early part of the 20th century, and wireless telegraphy and X-rays and cinema and bicycles and cars and
bicycles. Oh, the scourge of the urban person, the bicycle. I mean, I think that this kind of dovetails with another question that I wanted us to talk about, which is, I feel like every major era in science fiction is responding to developments in society, but also in science. And, we're pretty familiar with what animated the Golden Age. We already discussed that was kind of Cold War, but it's also atomics, it's space flight. The New Wave, which is sort of characterizes the 60s and 70s, are responding to massive upheavals around the globe and post-colonialism. So what is the Radium Age responding to? Partly we've already talked about, it's responding to these unknown forces being harnessed, like electricity, like radiation. But it's also responding to social upheavals, like, say, World War I, the Spanish flu. How do you see that fitting into some of the tropes that come out of this subgenre?
Well, of course, World War I sort of blew people's minds. That's right in the middle of this period. And I think it was Scott Fitzgerald who talks about how, his generation came back from World War I with all gods dead and, all certainties shattered. And so, that's certainly kind of along the lines of what we were talking about. But it's also the era of women's suffrage, which was another way of like completely upending what people took to be like natural and inevitable and permanent and normal, but it actually turned out to be a cultural construct that women shouldn't have the vote and that women should be equals. NAACP is doing the same thing for people of color in the United States. Socialist currents in the labor movement, right? So socialism was kind of, becoming more mainstream and kind of widely accepted. And in the 30s, it wasn't laughable to be a socialist.
Unions were becoming a very powerful force.
Just revolutionary upheaval, around the globe. I mean, we think of the 19th century being the era of revolutions, but the democracy, the spread of democracy was kind of happening, and anti-colonialism and so forth was kind of getting off the ground in the first decades of the 20th century, and anarchism was happening. So, I mean, there's a little bit of overlap from like the late 19th century to the early 20th century on some of these things, but there's a lot of ferment happening socially, culturally, economically. And then, of course, backlash to those things. So someone like G.K. Chesterton is horrified by what he's seeing
Right.
in the world, and he's writing his science fiction in kind of response to that sort of stuff. There's when women get the vote. Booth Tarkington writes a science fiction novel about Atlantis, about how basically the reason that Atlantis sunk was because women had gained too much power, and they learned the techniques of science, and then there's a battle between all the men and all the women, and they ended up sinking Atlantis. So these kinds of things.
Yeah. So yeah, anxieties about what the future would bring after we have these social transformations. I mean, it's interesting because I feel like, now, in fact, you were even saying like science fiction is sort of about the future. I feel like that it's during this radium age phase of proto science fiction that we really start to get that idea that we're going to have a genre that looks to the future that's a fictional genre, as opposed to, say, people just writing essays or, sort of talking about what might come next. Is that a sense that you get too? I know, of course, there's always been people writing about the future. I'm not saying like it emerged whole cloth, but I mean that it gets popularized. It becomes something that like a lot of people are interested in, as opposed to a few like nerds who are like, oh, what can we say about the future in 1800 or whatever?
Yeah. I mean, obviously Wells was an incredibly popular author, so his books were
sure.
He was one of the authors of the day. So he really helped, popularize that idea. So a lot of my favorite science fiction from this era is either imitating Wells or anti-Wells. So like Ian Forster is making fun of Wellsian utopia in The Machine Stopped. And in fact, a lot of the most entertaining dystopias from the period are sort of having fun with the idea of Wells's idea of a technocratic utopia where everything's perfect and efficient and but yeah, I mean, so science fiction really goes mainstream with I think Ray Bradbury and the Martian Chronicles, like in the 50s probably, but that process of it going mainstream certainly started happening in this era, and there were certain successes, but I think it was still fairly niche-y until like the pulps came out, and those were just incredibly popular, and some of them had hundreds of thousands or millions.
Yeah.
And then you have Hugo Gernsback, after whom the Hugo Award is named, just cranking out one science fiction magazine after another. He was kind of a bad businessman, but he really knew what he wanted. He wanted, science fiction that was like Vernon Wells, but it was predicting the future, and it was very technological based. He was also much more open towards women writing for him. He didn't have any problem, he didn't have to decide your name if you wanted to write for Hugo Gernsback's magazines. But later, and those guys, you had to a woman wanted to write for them, they had to have a man's name. So,
or just initials.
Yeah, but things started going backwards with the golden age and Campbell and those guys in some ways. Much as the writing did get kind of elevated and more, palatable, but a lot of things about their politics and and their rewriting of history was unpalatable.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that I don't know if I would agree that in the golden age the writing became more elevated, but what I would say is that it became a more lucrative market. So you could make a living writing short stories in the 50s, and in fact many of these guys did. And Robert Silverberg talks about that a lot. Like, yeah, he could just churn out short stories, and that was a living. And that was how he got started, and lots of other people did. Whereas I think in the 20s and 30s, it would be something that wowould be supplemented by another career. I know that Evie Odell, who we were talking about earlier, who wrote the Radium Age classic, The Clockwork Man, he wrote a couple novels, but he earned a living as an editor. And that was like, he worked in the publishing industry, but he couldn't just make a living on writing stories or books about the future. It is really interesting to me that this is a period in history when we start to get this idea that you can sell stories about the future. So it's not just about science, it's specifically about the future. And of course, not all of this proto-science fiction is about the future. Some of it is like an alternate present, or it's an apocalypse that happens in the present day.
Lost races.
Yeah, right. Or like time travel, or lots of other things, time travel into the past. but it's the era of the futurists, who are actually talking about how, the present is so speedy due to automobiles and jazz that like everything is sort of turning into the future before you realize it. And I feel like this is the genre that kind of rises up to answer that feeling, that vibe, that like we're already living in the future. And so our literature is about the future because that's the only way to talk about the present. And I think that was kind of how people felt at that time, very dislocated, that they didn't know what was coming next. And especially after World War I and the Spanish flu, I mean, I feel like it was a time sort of similar to what we're living through now. So I wonder, for my last question for you before we go to the audience, if you can talk about how Radium Age science fiction, I feel like it feels newly relevant. So how do you feel about that? Are we living through a new Radium Age?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I first was writing about it for you in 2009, there was a lot of IO9 readers really enjoyed it, but 10 years later, the MIT Press wants to do a series on it, and I think that it's because, it's newly relevant. And I think what's happening is that, unfortunately, we're entering into another period of, chaos and things that we thought were going to last, forever. For example, liberal democracy are in danger, and there's a sense that maybe these things are going to change. So, and of course, technology is continuing to like race forward. And the thing you hear, every time I turn on the radio, there's somebody trying to understand what Bitcoin is. And nobody can do it. And so I do think that there's things that are, there's a sense that, we've lost control. Technology is out of our control. It's scary again. It's not just, making our lives better. There's a sense that maybe we're heading into a dystopian future. And just history is back. Before the call, you and I were talking about how when we were in college, I'm a little bit older than you, but around the time we were in college, the Berlin Wall came down. And there was this sense, I didn't agree with it at the time, but there was a little bit of, it kind of made sense why people would say that history was ending. That, this kind of big alternative to our world, which was, represented by the Soviet Union, had gone away and failed. And so there was nothing was ever going to challenge, the way that you and I lived, the world that we grew up in. And for a long time, that sort of seemed like those people were right. But now it doesn't feel that way anymore. So, especially like right now at this moment. So it is a scary, chaotic phase that we're in. So yeah, it feels like we can learn a lot from reading Radium Age science fiction, how those people back then were dealing with, what they were going through.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to open it up to audience questions. If anybody has anything, you can type it in the box. And Annalee or Josh will answer it for you. Also, there's a little green button at the bottom of y'all's screens. If you want to buy the Radium Age from us, you can buy it there at Madison Street Books.
Yeah, while people are typing their questions, I should say what's in this first book.
Yes.
So the first book is called Voices from the Radium Age, or my light is making it a little hard to see. Beautiful cover by Seth. And this is the book that just came out today, actually, World of Women by J.D. Beresford, with introduction by Astor Taylor. And in this first story collection, we have a story by Rokeya Sakawat Hussain, who was a Muslim Bengali feminist, 1905, kind of an early proto-utopia, feminist utopia. The Voice in the Night by William Hope Hodgson, who was this, weird writer, wrote about the, tentacles and horror. And this is kind of a story about humans being taken over by fungus. The Machine Stops, as Annalee and I mentioned, by E.M. Forster, which if you've seen the movie Wall-E, it's basically that story was sort of ported over to Wall-E. Horror of the Heights, which is Arthur Conan Doyle, so Sherlock Holmes author, wrote a lot of early science fiction. The Red One by Jack London, about basically a slaver. He's a naturalist who's riding around on a slaver ship in the tropics. He hears a weird sound in the jungle, and he goes off into the jungle and he discovers basically alien technology, unknowable alien technology. And The Comet by W.E.B. Du Bois. And Neil R. Jones is The Jameson Satellites. I wanted to have one kind of pulp story from the 30s. So a wide range of authors and types of authors and years from that era and themes. So trying to capture a sense of what was happening during the Radium Age.
I got a question for you, Josh. Are there any stories, notable shout outs, anything that didn't make it into either of the books? Do you almost put in there?
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, there's things left on the cutting room floor, but I'm going to put them in the second collection. So I don't want to totally reveal that yet, but
cool.
there will be
no, that's okay.
Collection. Let me mention, I think we're still waiting for questions. Let me mention a couple of the other titles that are coming out. So the third title that we'll do will be The Clockwork Man by E.V. Odell, which Annalee and I talked about a little bit, and Annalee wrote the introduction to that one. And then we're going to do H.G. Wells's book, The World Set Free, which is about how nuclear war, essentially the use of atomic bombs in war, kind of ends war. Wells was the guy who coined the unfortunate phrase, the war to end all war. He really believed that was going to happen. And a kind of utopia that gets set up after this atomic war. Pauline Hopkins was an African-American Bostonian writer who wrote a science fiction novel about an African nation that's kind of been hiding in plain sight, and they have advanced technology. And an African-American man is passing as white, travels archaeological journey and discovers what's going on. Nordenholt's Million is a interesting book by J.J. Connington, who was a Scottish scientist, chemist, and but he wrote under the name J.J. Connington. And it's kind of a fascist book about how there's an eco-catastrophe and people are starving, and he, in kind of an Ayn Randian kind of way, saves the world through brutally and efficiently gathering the people he needs together in this one valley and letting everyone else die and even hastening everyone else's death. So it's actually a very unpleasant message in some ways, but I find those things quite interesting. Whatnot by Rose.
There's one. Yeah. Oh no, sorry. There's one question down here. Yeah. I don't know if y'all can see it on your end. So somebody wrote in. It's kind of a big question. So let's see if we can answer it. So if we're in a time like the Radium Age in terms of chaos and breakdown, what's our radium? What's the objective correlative of the breakdown of liberalism, the climate, etc.? What is the symbol or the token or totem of our chaos?
Yeah, that sounds like Matthew Ballard.
Yeah.
Annalee,
yes, it is actually.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's such an interesting question. I mean, of course, it's hard to know in the middle of a historical moment what exactly the moment means. But I would say that, I think our radium is currently the internet and all of its manifestations, right? Because when we say internet, that really can mean anything from like, I am sitting at my computer looking at Wikipedia to I am using my phone to operate a bridge, and so I think that the interconnectedness of objects and people through basically wireless technology, through some fiber optic technology, I think that's gonna be a symbol for everything that we tried to get right and that turned out to be toxic and giving us cancer, right? So, radium, hey, it's great, but don't lick it.
Yeah.
Don't bathe in it. Don't paint watch faces with it and lick the paintbrush. And so
don't use the internet to help your fellow suburban ethno-nationalists to storm the White House and stop the presidential election from happening.
Yeah, I think, and I think that we're going to look back on this era, from a future where we figured out how to regulate the internet, and we'll say like, oh my God, how could they just be letting the internet go everywhere like that? And that we're going to have, warning labels on it, and we're going to have all kinds of, regulatory.
We'll all be on private internets. You know what I mean? We'll have our own internet.
Yeah, it'll be kind of separated out into little walled internets, and So I do think that that's going to be one of the technologies. And then the other possibility, which is just now emerging, right, is that it could be some kind of biotech device. And so we'll see. We'll see if we finally have some kind of technological leap forward that turns us into cyborgs, and we'll be like, oh yeah, it turns out that this was the century of actual cyborgs. And, we don't even remember the internet because we are the internet now. So what do you think, Josh?
No, I agree with you. Yeah, I can't think of anything better than the internet.
It really is like radium. It has the same, it's a dual use technology that can be really destructive and also incredibly useful and revolutionary.
Yeah, people were so excited about radium at the time, as you were mentioning about licking it. I mean, we used it for everything, and people thought it was kind of a health. There's this idea of living radium, that it was, because it was moving, they could see that it was moving and shooting off energy, that it was somehow kind of alive, and that it was sort of a life force. So therefore, we should have radium-infused water that we should drink, and we should have, et cetera. There's some it's pretty scary looking back.
Matthew Battle says, "Don't lick the internet" is correct. It's true. Don't do that. Don't wear the internet on your face as makeup. Just don't do that.
I have another question on my end, y'all.
Yeah.
This one's: are you considering any untranslated Radium Age books? And what's the process like for finding books from outside the English language from the Radium Age?
Thank you. Great question. So, I'm actually kind of running out of the English language books that I want to republish. We're working sort of 3-4 years in advance now, so we're already planning our schedule way in advance. And there's only so many kind of U.S. and English books from England that I want to publish, but you have to get the rights, to the translations, or you have to get your own translations done. So this just takes longer. It's more expensive, but we have contracted to do a Bangla science fiction from the early 1930s, which has never been translated into English before. I'm really excited about that one.
Me too.
Yeah. And, I'm going to publish, there are some works that were translated at the time, and they were translated in English so long ago that the translations are in public domain. So, for example, there's like a Russian science fiction writer who I want to include in, I don't want to say the name or the story, but it's going to be the next collection, where that translation was done, so long ago now that it's in public domain. But yeah, it's a tricky process. I have a great team of advisors, including Annalee, who that's kind of one of their jobs, is to kind of help, help me. They don't have to come up with the titles themselves, but help me find the people, the scholars who are studying these areas, who are interested in Indian science fiction from before 1935, or anything coming out of various countries in Africa, or Russian science fiction. So it's harder to find because that the genre didn't spread as widely as you might imagine. And sometimes it wasn't very good. So, for example, Ken Liu was helping me find Chinese science fiction from before 1935. And there is some of it's just really not very good. So you would have to kind of do maybe some excerpts from it. It was used in a very kind of didactic way. And oftentimes it was just kind of imitating like Baron Munchausen or something, but just writing it to be about China. But it's slightly in the future, so it's science fiction. So it's harder to find this stuff, but we're going to find it. But that's the nice thing about working several years in advance, is we can start getting things translated and looking at that. It takes time.
There's one more sweet one. Just daydreaming about these on my shelf. Can you please show the spine of the books?
Oh, sure.
I need a little smiley face.
That's a real bibliophile wants to see the spine. So here's the MIT logo.
Yeah. Exciting.
Yeah, and they're gonna look great together.
I guess I got a question for y'all. We'll wait for like 1 or 2 more questions if they trickle in. Are y'all reading anything right now that you're liking?
In science fiction?
Yeah, in science fiction or in general.
Well, I'm a big fan of Annalee's science fiction.
Okay.
I want to know when's the Terraformers coming out? Isn't that supposed to be?
It's coming. It's my next novel. It's coming out in January. I'm actually just finishing up the revision. I'm turning it in probably tomorrow. So yeah, it's set in the same universe as my novel Autonomous, but it's 50,000 years in the future. So none of the same characters, but some of the same issues. So
even the robot's consciousness doesn't survive 50,000 years. I guess everything changes.
There are robots with human equivalent consciousness, and there are also non-human animals with human equivalent consciousness. So the main characters are a moose and a flying train and a kind of a post-human sort of. They're called Homo diversus. They're like a human, but with other traits as well. So. Wow. Yeah, so the moose is like my favorite character I've ever written, I think.
Moose in science fiction of that. I can't.
And the moose has like a really satisfying love story. So it's also a romance. And yeah, I'm really excited about it. I am reading a novel right now that I cannot wait for everybody to read. It's not out yet. It's by Silvia Moreno Garcia. It is called The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. So speaking of Radium Age science fiction, The Island of Dr. Moreau, of course, is like late 19th century H.G. Wells story, which is extremely anti-colonialist. And the original novel, the H.G. Wells novel that Moreno Garcia is playing with, is set in the South Pacific on this island where a man is creating what he hopes will be obedient laborers by giving animals these chemical injections that turn them into people, animal people, hybrids. And then, of course, there's a 1932 movie based on it called The Island of Lost Souls, which is just incredible, really disturbing. So Moreno Garcia sets her novel in Yucatan. And Moreau is sick of dealing with the Maya laborers who keep rebelling. And so he's decided, all right, well, we'll just get a bunch of dogs and cats and jaguars and turn them into pliant laborers. It's such an amazing novel. I love her writing so much. And it's kind of a fairy tale, and it's kind of hyper realistic at the same time. And it's going to be out in a few months. So.
That sounds really good. And you're reminding me of the plot of RUR too, speaking of Chapek, the idea of semi-biological laborers who revolt.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's I just finished this novel dealing with non-human animals being kind of uplifted. I've been thinking a lot about that trope, which comes out of the Radium Age, this idea that we will turn animals into kind of human equivalent beings and interact with them. Yeah, and it is very much related to the idea of the robot. There's almost always an uprising as a result. Turns out giving a creature human equivalent intelligence and then telling them that they are not equal and not free doesn't work out very well in the end. They will just kill you, especially if they're part jaguar. So that's kind of fun. So yeah, I don't know. I actually if we don't have another question, I wanted to ask you, Josh, about some of the tropes that we see in Radium Age, which are still totally with us, like dystopia. Like, how are the dystopias of the Radium Age different from modern dystopias? Or are they like actually weirdly similar?
Well, yeah, I mean, so a lot of these dystopias are happening before Stalin and before Hitler. Yeah. So we didn't have anything to base them on, right? So yeah, they're just kind of, they're
based on. Go ahead.
They're predicting fascism, but
yeah,
it's not based on actual fascism. But were you going to say it's based on something?
Oh, I was going to say I think it's based on colonialism.
Right.
I mean, that isn't. I guess we don't call that fascism, but you have some dude come in and start telling everybody that they're enslaved. Like, that feels kind of like fascism to me. I don't know. I guess it's a different format.
I mean, we know that like the British invented the concentration camp in Africa during the Boer War. So yeah, it's fascism was happening before fascism happened for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's And there's eco-catastrophes they were obsessed with.
Yeah.
A little bit coming out of like the biblical tradition of the flood, right? Because people were quite religious still. So some of it's just kind of riffing on. There's a famous one called Deluge, which was really popular at the time, which is just basically the flood. All the bunch of land settles. But there's just a lot of worries about things like, for example, the Panama Canal. People were worried that you can't connect to ocean. That's a bad idea. And that it'll lead to like terrible catastrophes. Or, like you think of MP Shields, The Purple Cloud, where the discovery of the North Pole, which hadn't actually happened yet, but it was about to happen, sort of triggers, man wasn't meant to be there. And it's one of these kind of Promethean things where you can't steal the fire from the gods. We weren't supposed to go to the North Pole. There's some kind of cosmic chthonic energy there. By getting there, we screwed things up, and now the Earth realizes like the humans are on it, and it wants to wipe us out. Just one of those kinds of things.
Wow, I love that. All these land masses are yours except the North Pole. Kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, there was the idea of the Sims holes, like that. Like there was holes into the center of the Earth at the poles, and so maybe that's kind of how, if there was an Earth spirit of some kind, if the Earth was was an entity, a Gaia-like entity, that would be where its sort of consciousness was, or access to it. So you can't go there.
Right. I love that idea has come back, by the way, because N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy has the planet is inhabited by some kind of malevolent force in the center of the planet, but also the documentary about Godzilla and King Kong, where they like punch their way through into the center of the Earth. Actually, no, wait, Godzilla burns his way through or something. It's quite, it ends with like King Kong kind of happily living in the center of the Earth. So, but we have another question from the audience. I don't have to keep talking about Godzilla and King Kong.
No, that's okay. Will you be publishing new editions of any of the pulpier stories of the period, such as those of Hugo Gernsback?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm trying to do two things with the series. One is let people know that there's this like whole area of science fiction that you don't know about, and there's like some really, really good writing. So I am trying to kind of focus on quality. However, I also want it to be really fun, and it's not just about it's not just for scholars and science fiction exegetes and historians. It should be for anyone who just likes to read good, fun adventures. So, for example, I mentioned Neil R. Jones, complete pulp writer, not super great writing, but fun. So yeah, I would like to eventually do some of the later. I mean, part of the problem too is, right now we're focusing on works that are in public domain for just financial reasons. So some of the fun pulpy stuff comes later than this. So right now we're, I think, only up to 1926 is in public domain. But you'll get into like E.E. Doc Smith and Jack Williamson and the people who invented space opera and that kind of fun stuff will come a little bit later. Yeah, so we're not quite there yet, but I hope to eventually do some of that stuff as well. I like it.
Cool.
And if you like Ian Banks, you have to like E.E. Doc Smith. Sorry.
Yeah, and I always rebel against this idea that you can actually really tell the difference between literature and pulp. Like you can't like pour them into like a beaker and be like, aha, yes, it's literature. This is a reputable experiment. I think one generation's literature is another generation's pulp, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is such a thing as bad writing. Like I think Isaac Asimov is a bad writer, very smart writer, very smart thinker, but I don't enjoy his writing at all. It's just white guys talking to each other. Which I'm glad.
That's a lot of literature too, dude. Yeah. I need to tell you. It's a lot of white guys talking to each other.
Yes.
Bless their little hearts.
I mean, I think people like Asimov who complained about, he edited some really good collections of 1930s pulp that he liked, which helped me a lot in my research. But he also made it very clear that he thought that a lot of it was very juvenile and embarrassing and whatever. And, I think he's right about some of it, but he's wrong about some of it. So I don't want to say that all pulp fiction is good. I think some of it's pretty bad, but I do agree there's a lot of gems in there that I think that we have.
Yeah, I think there's like bad literature, bad pulp, good literature. So, I feel like the goal of this series is good stuff, regardless of whether it is literary or pulpy. So
yes, and I would rather read pulp than bad literature any day.
Oh my God, yes. Yeah. Nothing worse than bad literature, I feel like, because it's hard to read and then it sucks. It's just like What are you doing?
Yeah, and one thing, pulp is never pretentious. You know what I mean? It's never, it's not rubbing your root nerves raw in that way.
Yeah, it's just like, I'm gonna tell you a story, and it's gonna be maybe kind of silly, but it's gonna be fun. So, yeah. Is there any one of the subgenres in the Radium Age that you think has not survived? Like, is there like a what I mean by that is, are there any tropes that are really popular in the Radium Age that then just kind of die out and never really make it into modern sci-fi?
Such a good question. I mean, I'm focusing on the ones that did survive, but yeah,
Right.
I'm sure. One of the interesting ones to me is the idea of the Superman that first appears. I mean, nothing ever first appears anywhere. There's always a precursor.
Sure.
It becomes popular, and people are excited about the idea of the Superman in the early 20th century. And of course, at that time, the Superman was a terrifying idea. People didn't want there to be a Superman because this person would perceive normal humans as animals. You know what I mean? As Nietzsche has Zarathustra say, that man to Superman will be a laughingstock. So, and so there's this idea that if Superman did arise again through mutation or some kind of laboratory thing where people were directing electronic rays to their brain, or however the Superman got created,
licking radium.
Around us, be like, oh my God, you people are idiots. You're doing everything wrong. And obviously, this was a way to criticize World War I and criticize dumb things happening in culture and society. But there was a sense that they would be very sinister and evil, and they weren't like kindly and good looking. They all had giant heads and they're freaky looking and scary. I think that didn't really survive because throughout the Golden Age, Supermen became awesome, and they were sort of our saviors, and they were going to help us. And then, of course, they went into comic books, and they all became these gorgeous, beautiful, sexy, nice, saviors of us. I think that began to change with like the Watchmen. We kind of returned to this idea of like, oh, maybe we wouldn't want someone to be like the smartest man in the world, because they would think that they can just, in order to save us, they would be happy to kill everyone in New York if that would save the planet. You know what I mean? So I think maybe that's coming back a little bit now, but yeah,
that's so interesting, because I know that that was kind of the idea in the Batman v Superman movie, which was not a good movie, but was about Superman being a fascist, and that felt very weird and alien, because there's been just such a long history of Superman just being a nice guy from the Midwest, and he's kind of strong, but like, it's weird that figure mutated so much over the 20th century.
Yeah. Well, we saw that in The Dark Knight. I mean, Frank Miller is a reprehensible character in many ways, but The Dark Knight was good about sort of having Batman, Superman becomes kind of a fascist who's like, helping to stomp out the other superheroes, and Batman and Green Arrow have to stop him and fun stuff.
Yeah.
That's a trope that kind of vanished. I think the idea of the kind of the unknowable alien, the alien that you couldn't even begin to conceive of what they wanted from us, or what they weren't like humans at all, was something that was an early idea about aliens that you find in the Radium Age, and they become more like these humanoids, so you can figure them out pretty easily, and you can work with them.
Or they literally tell you, like, they come to Earth and they give a speech, and they're like, if you don't stop using atomics, we're going to be mad, and so but like now I would say, again, the unknowable alien is back, like with a movie like Arrival, which is of course based on the Ted Chiang story, and he loves unknowable aliens and writes them so well. And like, I feel like Doctor Who, Solaris is a great example, and I feel like Doctor Who has like run into some unknowable aliens. Well, maybe more like Torchwood actually is what I'm thinking of. Less Doctor Who. In fact, Doctor Who, the aliens always seem to just announce their intentions, which is very, very relaxing.
Well, we didn't mention Charles Fort here, who was this guy who went around collecting weird scientific anomalies during that era, and he really influenced a lot of science fiction writers, because he put them together in these books about like frogs raining down on people, frogs, whatever, all kinds of vanishing judges, etc. And that idea of the of maybe we're fodder. Maybe we were seeded here on Earth to be prey at some later date. Aliens are going to come back and like take stuff from us once we had advanced to a certain point. Just creepy ideas like that were very common in the Radium Age, and I think to some extent died out during the Gold Age and then came back again later.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, we have like the Predator series now where it's kind of like Earth is like a wildlife preserve for for Predator to come and shoot us. Although they don't really develop that idea into the complete wildlife preserve. It's more like just a few predators.
Well, isn't there a Predator prequel coming out soon? I bet they'll get into it there.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, you can do almost anything with Predator. I've been enjoying the series. The important documentary. All right. Does anybody have a final question for us? I know we've just got a couple more minutes.
There's no more questions, but I'll ask one as well.
Awesome.
We've talked about it a little bit, but where do y'all think sci-fi is trending towards right now? Any musings on that you'd like to share? It's kind of a lofty question too.
Annalee is a much better person to ask this question than I am, but let me just give my 2 cents very quickly.
Yeah.
So the reason I started doing the science fiction stuff in the first place, I'm not a science fiction scholar or any kind of scholar, but I'm a reader, and I like, I'm kind of an obsessive reader, and I wanted to make sure I hadn't missed any good science fiction, which is how I discovered this whole era of missed science fiction. But in spending the last 10 or 15 years reading 20th century science fiction and other genres, I wasn't reading 21st century stuff. And I'm catching up now and I'm reading Annalee and Charlie Jane and M.K. Jemisin and all these people. And what's incredible is how it's really just in the last 15 or 20 years that so much science fiction being published by women and all the best science fiction by women. We'd think going back to the 90s, 80s, 70s, that of course there were very good women writing in that period, but still such a small percentage. And now when I look at my list of must-read science fiction and my favorite science fiction, all women. Kind of an amazing, very recent shift in my very unexpert opinion.
I definitely think that that's true as we look to the present and future of science fiction. We're very lucky to be in an era when a lot of women and non-binary people and people of color are being published. And to a slight extent, they're also becoming part of the publishing industry. I think that's kind of the final frontier, is getting editors who are people of color coming in and making decisions. So in terms of the content of science fiction, my prediction is that we're entering an era when we're going to start seeing a rejuvenation of the utopian novel. It's something that was very influential in the Radium Age. There were a lot of utopian speculations, and not naive. They would be like, here's the utopia, here's the flaws in the utopia, here's why the utopia can only exist on this isolated island with only 10 people,
Well,
but
Le Guin would call it an ambiguous utopia.
Yeah, Le Guin talks about that. And I think, The Dispossessed, which is her ambiguous utopia, is an interesting example of trying to do that kind of utopian thinking. But I suspect that what we're going to be seeing really in the next 5 to 10 years is going to be responding to the fact that we're living in a very dystopian time, or a time that resembles what science fiction calls a dystopia. There's climate change, there's fascism, there's all kinds of other social issues that are happening that are terrible. And I think that we're going to want utopian writing, not just as an escape, but also as a form of social criticism, as a way of saying, here's where we could go from here. We don't need the warning of a dystopia. We actually know how bad things can get. And now we need a roadmap into a better place. How do we do it? And I think it's going to happen. And it might not look the way you would expect. It might not be kind of like Herland, where it's like, and now we enter the utopia where women rule and men are marginalized. It might look, very complicated, but I think we all want that. We want a picture of a better world.
Yeah, one thing I loved when I first started reading the Radium Age was this idea that another world is possible. People really believed that in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. That we could have, people thought H.G. Wells was maybe a little bit simplistic in his thinking about what that would look like, but people had not, as we were talking about the socialists and the labor movement, people thought that you could change things. And then that kind of went away all during the Cold War, right? In the era, age of consensus. And people didn't really believe change could happen anymore. And now people are, I do think, at least especially young people, maybe not cynical Gen Xers, but younger generations kind of believe that again, which is wonderful. So I do,
and we have the revival of a labor movement happening. We even have a cat on our side in the labor movement, which is very science fictional. So anyway, for those who don't know about Jorts the cat, just Google it. Jorts really supports your labor movement.
I feel like that's a perfect place to end this on that.
End with Jorts.
Thank you y'all so much for chatting with us and everything. Again, please buy the Radium Age from us down there, the green button. Supporting Annalee's stuff coming out. Y'all were awesome. It was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. So
thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and keep your eyes out for all of the books coming out in the Radium Age series, because they're going to, how often are they coming out? Every couple months?
Yeah, well, we're going to do 7 this year, and then we'll slow down the pace a little bit after that. But yeah, after that, it'll be
collect them all. That is the goal.
Yeah, I'll certainly be picking up A World of Women. That one looks so cool to me. The others, of course. Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you, everybody.
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming.
Have a good night and good luck with all your endeavors.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely.